I'm Teresa Marques. I'm a philosopher at the University of Barcelona. Today, I will defend the apparently trivial claim that misogyny is the hatred of women. This view has been questioned by Kate Manne in a recent book, Down Girl, The Logic of Misogyny, where she says that the view is naive, offers some challenges to the view, and gives instead an ameliorated concept of misogyny that's supposed to lay down the logic of misogyny. I think that she doesn't completely succeed in arguing against the naive view or in motivating the ameliorated concept, partly because she ignores the logic of hate, that is, how hate as an emotion functions, in particular hate directed at groups of people in social contexts. This is what I'll do. I will start by presenting a version of the claim that misogyny is the hatred of women. I will then present Kate Manne's challenges to the naive view and her alternative account. She claims instead that misogyny's essence lies in its social function and not its psychological nature. Her account relies heavily on moral psychology, however, and this raises the same kind of epistemic challenge to her view that she raises to what she calls the naive view, the claim I want to defend, that misogyny is the hatred of women. Moreover, recent research in anthropology on the psychology of hate and on features of generics suggests or shows that what she calls the naive view can indeed meet the explanatory challenge that she raises against misogyny, understood as the hatred of women. So let's start with the basics on misogyny, women, and hate. Different dictionaries give very similar definitions of misogyny. So the Merriam-Webster dictionary says, for instance, that misogyny is the hatred of, aversion to, or prejudice against women. The etymology of the word comes from the Greek roots misein, to hate, and gyne, woman. The Oxford English Dictionary gives a similar definition, that misogyny is the hate for women that some people feel. Misogyny can also be applied to speech or behavior that reflects and fosters misogyny. So if misogyny is the hatred of women, and if hate is an emotion, we should understand in the first place how emotions work. So in the current work on philosophy and psychology of emotions, a relatively or rather well-received view is that emotions themselves are particular kinds of states. They are particular kinds of mental states that are special kinds of normative appraisals. So emotions are intentional states. For instance, a child can be afraid of a spider. The spider in this case is the intentional object of the emotion, the intentional object of the child's fear. The child could be afraid not of spiders, but say of daisies. That would seem silly, but it would then, in this case, give us a different intentional object for the same mode of emotion, the same kind of emotion, fear. So fear can be fitting or not. So fear would be fitting of a spider if it is fear of a spider that is dangerous, for instance, that is poisonous, but it's not fitting of a flower. So the emotion here, fear, will be defined, identified by what constitutes it. So it will be defined by its the type of normative appraisal that makes it correct to have. So fear would be an attitude that is fit or apt to have for things that are dangerous, and not apt for things that are not dangerous. Okay, so these normative appraisals can be, and often are by different authors, called formal objects of the emotions. These are not the intentional objects. These are not the content of the emotion. The formal objects are not represented. They are what appraises, what makes the conditions of correctness of a given emotion, given the content of, or the object that is the content of the emotion. Okay, so if misogyny is hate and hate is an emotion, what is its intentional object? Well, the intentional object of misogyny is women, are women in general, women qua women, and the formal object would be given by whatever appraisal norm, whatever condition of appraisal is the right one to identify hate as such. In this case, hate of women qua women. So now that we've laid down the basics, what are Kate Manne's challenges to the idea that misogyny is the hatred of women? So she characterizes the view that misogyny is the hate of women as a naive view. And she says that if this were the correct view of what misogyny is, it would be primarily a property of individual misogynists who are prone to hate women while women, that is, because they are women either universally or at least very generally. So we can ask, what is wrong with this characterization? Well, she raises a few challenges. One of the challenges that Kate Manne raises is an epistemic challenge. She says that if misogyny is the hatred of women, then how can we know if someone is a misogynist? She says, for what lies behind an individual agent's attitudes as a matter of deep or ultimately psychological explanation is frequently inscrutable. This would threaten to make misogyny epistemically inaccessible to women in particular. So we might never know for real, really, if someone is a misogynist or not. And on the other hand, this would be at odds with the experience of many women who face hostility in society. Another challenge is what we might call the explanatory challenge. So women face a lot of hostility in society in many different contexts, but not all men hate women. And even clear misogynists don't hate all women, as Kate Manne says. In this case, we have an illustration from the 19th century of the Book of Proverbs, edited in France. And this one in particular would show us he who loves well punishes well. So the punishment, violent physical punishment of women here would be a sign of love and not a sign of hate. Very well. So what Manne calls a naive conception would fail, she claims, to encompass more than a psychologically and hence metaphysically obscure phenomenon. So this phenomenon would be metaphysically obscure because it's psychological. That's the claim. And in the face of this, we want to explain certain features of misogyny. So misogyny has certain conceptual role to play, picking out the most hostile and noxious facets of gender-based oppression. And presumably, the problem with the explanatory challenge is that psychology doesn't really explain this. What is Kate Manne's proposal then? Well, her proposal is that a significant amount of misogyny in my milieu, that is, in the kind of world in which she moves, in the English-speaking world, presumably, between Australia and the US, serves to police and inform and enforce social roles and extract moral goods and resources from women. These are, I think, cartoons of forced marriages, and I think they were supposed to be critical of these cartoons, of the practice of forced marriage. I'm not sure. So, Kate Manne says that misogyny is a property of social environments. That's her thesis, her claim, where women may encounter hostility due to the enforcement and policing of patriarchal norms and expectations, often insofar as they violate patriarchal law and order. Its essence lies in its social function, not its psychological nature. So that's the claim that she makes. That's her thesis. In developing her thesis, she says a lot of very interesting things and makes very interesting and insightful arguments. Some of them are really metaphorical. So for instance, this distinction between sexism and misogyny requires that we conceive of the patriarchy as a kind of government or organization or institution that is organized and divided in different branches, where it would have one branch, which would be the ideological branch that legislates. So sexism would be the ideological branch of patriarchal order that justifies and rationalizes patriarchal social order, whereas misogyny would be something like the judicial branch. So the branch that polices and enforces the governing norms and expectations. So this is really interesting. These are both very interesting ways of understanding sexism and misogyny, but they are rather metaphorical. And we would like to know, or should want to know, what is a non-metaphorical explanation of how misogyny works and how misogyny keeps in place or contributes to patriarchal norms, if that's what it does. In the non-metaphorical explanations that Kate Manne gives, she resorts to a very insightful, and I think the more interesting aspect of her work is the one that draws from Strawson's notions of reactive attitudes. So she says that these attitudes in the family of hostility have included resentment, spite, ill will, and various threatening and punitive tendencies. So misogyny involves what Strawson called interpersonal reactive attitudes. They have the potential to be leveled second personally, but oftentimes it seems to be second person plural. So they seem to be directed not at just another person, but as other people in groups. So in this case, against women as a group. So here's an example of how we could interpret it. Kate Manne talks, for instance, in the 8th chapter of the book, she talks of disgust. She talks of it in relation to presidential campaign and Hillary Clinton, but disgust of women, qua women, is something that is very common around the world. So many cultures stigmatize and consider that women are dirty and polluting and basically disgusting during the menstruation period. So in different countries, say in India and Nepal, women are sent to menstruating huts when they give birth or when they have their periods, but also in other continents, for instance, in Africa, we have places, for instance, like the bottom right image, which is in a village, a Jewish village in Ethiopia, where women are also sent to menstruating huts when they have their menses. So disgust sticks, stains, sips and catches. It's easy to learn from others. It's learned by association. It's as a moralizing influence, and it's hard to overcome when it's being acquired, let's say. And I think this is basically right. What I don't think is that she has posed a real problem for what she has called the naive view that misogyny is the hatred of women. So let's go back to the basic claim that misogyny is indeed the hatred of women. So what is the intentional object? Women as such, women qua women. Now the reference to women here is generic. So to consider a generic claim that men hate women, consider Germaine Greer's statement in her book, The Female Eunuch. Women have very little idea of how much men hate them. Later in the same chapter, she says, men don't themselves know the depth of their own hatred. Again, let me say, hashtag, not all men. Now, as a generic claim or as generic claims, like other or any generic claim, it can be true even if not all women, not most, not many, and even not some are hated by misogynists. So saying that misogynists don't hate all women, as Kate Manne says at some point in the book, is not a good argument against understanding misogyny as the hatred of women. Why? Well, these are well-known facts about generics. So for instance, Bernard Nichols says that generics seem to not just be substantially independent of statistical facts in the world, and at the time with respect to which they are evaluated, they seem to have implications for worlds or times beyond. You can see this by noting that some generics are false, even though all members of the kind conform to the generalization, while others are true, even though no members of the kind conform. So that's one possible objection. Let's go to the epistemic challenge then. So recall that she objected to the understanding misogyny as the hatred of women in terms of psychological mental state, which is hatred, that it might be inscrutable. Now, the same problem and the same challenge can be leveled against the claim that misogyny involves this family of attitudes in the neighborhood of hostility, like resentment, spite, ill will, disgust, etc., and various threatening and punitive tendencies. These are likewise inscrutable, and so any explanation that relies on these kinds of attitudes will face whatever challenge she is going to raise against hate. I don't particularly think that the challenge is very serious, so I'm not particularly worried about it. I don't think that you should be worried about the challenge with respect to reactive attitudes, but for the same reason, we shouldn't be worried about the challenge for understanding misogyny as hate. So why? Let's look at what is hate. So hate is developed when others mistreat or humiliate someone or whose deliberate actions have become an obstruction to someone's goals. This comes from a very good review, an extensive review of work on hate that is published in the journal Emotion Review. And the authors, Fisher et al., also say that when individuals experience hate, they perceive their hate targets as having malicious intentions and being immoral, which is accompanied by feelings of lack of control or powerlessness. These appraisals are not the result of one specific action, but of a belief about the stable disposition of the hated person or group. They also distinguish between episodic emotions of hate against the person for particular episodic reasons, or about long-term dispositions against the group. There's further work on hate, so Alperin et al. They say that the hate sentiments in intergroup contexts is a stable and familiar hating emotional attitude that organizes people's social world. And the goal of the hate sentiment is to eliminate the outgroup from the in-group's environment, for example, through an absolute separation from members of the other group, as happens with women who are sent to menstruating huts when they are contaminated. There's different work about hate, in particular in connection with violence and radicalization. So there's work by Matsumoto et al. They did empirical work that strongly suggests that the combinations of anger, contempt, and disgust comprise the basic elements of hatred and are key emotions associated with intergroup aggression. So from Fisher et al., we can generalize what the normative requirements or normative appraisals that hate makes, and that hate speech, that is expressive of hate, would make in a community. So when we accept and when we engage in particular kinds of emotions like hate. So hate would make a negative appraisal of outgroup members as malevolent or malicious just by being members of the group. There are certain action tendencies that go from revenge, exclusion, attacks, or destruction of the target group, or motivational goals like the desire to harm, humiliate, or kill the target. So these are very useful data. These are useful data that we can use to understand misogyny, although they are mostly developed in cases of social and political conflict between different ethnic groups or political groups. So here's an important point. So we have reached a particular point at which Kate Manne could say, sure, hate also plays an important role, but it's not the primary, it doesn't have explanatory priority. We need to have first an explanatory priority would be the structural patriarchal norms and organizations. And sure, it may be that people might have hatred, but that would be as a result of the existence of these norms. And so women that break the norms would be punished in a variety of ways, for instance. So this could be compatible with what she already says about reactive attitudes. I don't think that that's right. And the reason why I don't think that's right is because there are limits to this the plausibility of this explanation when we look at misogyny around the world. The image, by the way, is from drowning of baby girls in female infanticide, which is a practice that is still carried out in different parts of the world. So let's make an analogy first, right? So to understand what's at stake with structural explanations versus explanations that look at, among other things, the emotions and sentiments that might be shared in a community. So other authors argue that hate speech should be explained not in terms of hate. So Jeremy Waldron thinks that talking of hate is a distraction, that hate speech should be understood from the point of view of the people who are the targets of hate speech, and that they are undermined, and their assurance that they will not face violence or aggression or discrimination is undermined by hate speech. So this is similar to her account, to Manne's account of misogyny, because it focuses on the perspective of the people who are the targets of hate speech. Catherine Galber offers a different account in terms of a systemic discrimination approach toward hate speech. And so what is common in these structural institutional explanations is that the structures and the institutional aspects take priority over psychological phenomena, such as intentions, emotions, or mental states of agents. What is the problem here? Well, the problem of these accounts is that they don't really explain very flagrant cases of hate speech. In particular, for instance, cases of hate propaganda has happened with the RTLM radio propaganda in Rwanda before and during the genocide of the Tutsis, where the Tutsis were not discriminated and were not the protected group, let's say. They had more power, more social status, and more influence than the Hutus, and had done so for centuries. So we can ask, what is it that has explanatory priority? So many authors think that collective emotions have an important role in explaining certain particular kinds of social phenomena, including phenomena that have to do with political radicalization, the rise of the radical right or far-right parties. And for instance, Almel and Nagatsu say that collective emotions can function as both motivating and justifying reasons for jointly intentional actions. So Kate Mann's account relies on the previous existence of her patriarchal norms in her milieu. So this depends on particular social structures and institutions and norms that exist, well, let's say, in the English-speaking world. But since it relies on this, it cannot extend to misogyny beyond her milieu, that is, beyond their social situation. And so it can't really, and moreover, it doesn't really explain the genealogy of patriarchal norms. It doesn't explain the genealogy of misogyny as such, and why it is ubiquitous and why it occurs across cultures and across centuries. David Gilmour, not the guitarist of Pink Floyd, but the anthropologist who presumably most of you won't know, has a book on misogyny, and he says that misogyny is sexual prejudice that is symbolically exchanged among men. He also says that misogyny is close to being universal. That's part of his claim in the book on misogyny, has hit the data that he collects demonstrates, and therefore requires an explanation that goes beyond any ad hoc functionalist or structural interpretation. It's the result, he thinks, of effective ambivalence. Now, what he says here is very similar to what, for instance, Germaine Greer said in her 1971 book, I think. So he says, for instance, about the highlands in Papua New Guinea, that was where people lived basically as in Neolithic times, with no contact with civilizations from anywhere else in the world for centuries until the late 20th century. He says there's probably no place on earth where men and women are so intensely antagonistic toward one another, and where men have such a pervasive fear and loathing of women, a fear that centers on their reproductive functions and especially on their mysterious sexual organs and everything related to the vagina. Recall that Fisher et al. Did say that fear is a component of the development of hate. Compare now the fear and loathing that he describes in the tribes in Papua New Guinea with Germaine Greer talking about boys in English industrial towns. She says, women have very little idea of how much men hate them. Any boy who has grown in an English industrial town can describe how the boys used to go to the local dance balls and stand around all night until the pressure of the simplest kind of sexual urge prompted them to score a chick. The easier this was, the more they loathed the girls and identified them with the guilt that their squalid sexual release left them. Here again, loathing is the phrase that is reoccurring. So I won't have time to read through all of the examples, and there are hundreds more examples in Gilmour's book. So he talks of the highlands in New Guinea, where nowhere else in the world does fear the female body reach such a staggering pitch. Men tremble before female contagion and effluvia. Peoples in the Amazon, very far from Papua New Guinea, regard women as inferior to men, the work of the devil, destructive, polluting, and demonic. As many people will know, the Attic poets, that is the ancient Greek writers and authors, considered that women were the source of evil in the world. Remember, for instance, Pandora opening the box with all the evil in the world. Many religious texts include condemnations of women. So for instance, in the Leviticus, it says that a woman who has just conceived seed, so the woman who gives birth and born a man child, then she shall be unclean 7 days. So if a woman gives birth, she's unclean, she's polluting for 7 days, and so she should be kept away. If she bear a girl, if she has a girl, she should be unclean for she will be unclean for 2 weeks. Contemporary or more recent authors in Europe and elsewhere also write very misogynistic things. So Strindberg has works that feature the most destructive, murderous, demonic villainesses imaginable, female devils who destroy innocent men. The persistence of these attitudes with respect to women very plausibly relate to the conditions of women around the world. So the persistent inequality that is described in a recent report for the United Nations says that women and girls account for 71% of all victims of modern slavery. Women account for 99% of all victims of forced sexual exploitation, 84% of all victims of forced marriage, 58% of all victims of forced labor. Grace Forrest, who works for this foundation, says that we're seeing normalized exploitation in our economy, in transnational supply chains, and also in migration pathways. So what is it that has explanatory priority? I think it's hate first. I think that communities that accept and normalize misogyny, that is, that accept and normalize the hatred of women, accept that women are malevolent or malicious just by being women, accept acts and normalize acts of revenge, social exclusion, attacks against women, or destruction of women as permissible or required, normalize motivational goals such as the desire to harm, humiliate, or even kill women. So we overcome the explanatory challenge, I think.